Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Rasulillah. So now that the chapters are getting smaller, it's more challenging. So I decided that inshallah I'm going to highlight one or two stories or one or two sets of verses in what we read, which is essentially what I've been doing. But because there are so many chapters that are smaller now, it's going to be difficult to discuss everything. So we now are in Juz 19, and in Surah Al-Furqān, which we read in the beginning and we finished, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He ends the chapter in about a page and a half of these beautiful verses that describe the characteristics of His servants. And He begins this discussion and He says, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ, and the servants of the Merciful One. And everyone should read these last verses because these are the traits that we need to have. This is the character of the believer. But He begins, if all of the character traits, this is how Allah Ta'ala begins. He says, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا. The servants of the Merciful One, they walk on this earth peacefully. وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. And when ignorant people interact with them, they say peace. Meaning that they are not aggravated. They're not aggravating. They do not walk arrogantly. And this concept of walking peacefully and walking without arrogance is a theme that Allah repeats throughout the Quran, particularly in Surah Al-Luqman. When we get to that, when Luqman advises his son, he says, do not walk on the earth, do not walk with arrogance. And arrogance is a very grave sin. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, none of you will enter paradise if you have a mustard seed of arrogance in your heart. So the goal of our moral code is to rid ourselves of arrogance. And to be peaceful and to be people that are calming and not to be people that aggravate and are aggravating. And this goes both ways. So it's easy to do that by yourself. But then Allah Ta'ala says, when somebody bothers you with a خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ, an ignorant person aggravates you, or they say peace, salam. They don't aggravate back. And this is what's tough. Because when somebody instigates with you, at least for me, my inclination is to fight back. And this is not necessarily turn the other cheek. This is about argumentation, for the sake of argumentation. So this is an important set of traits that Allah Ta'ala ends this chapter with. And one of the things that He says that the servants, when they hear the verses of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, they do not fall on the believer blind and deaf. Meaning that when we hear what Allah Ta'ala says, we obey. And this is the difference between a sincere believer and somebody who just wants to use Islam for some worldly gain. The difference is when we hear it, we inculcate it, and we implement it. And we submit to it. Not that we choose and pick what we want. And this is related to the second story that we read in Surah Ash-Shu'ara. A very beautiful series of verses describing the interaction between Moses ﷺ and Pharaoh. And we know that every prophet that was sent, they were equipped with some tools that they were able to use as proof, they were able to use as assistance in their message. And usually these set of tools have to do with what was predominant in this community. So in ancient Egypt, sorcery and wizardry and magic, this was common. So Allah Ta'ala gave Moses from these things. He gave him the staff turning into the serpent. He made his arm, because Moses ﷺ was dark, he made his arm white when he pulled it out of his cloak. So when Moses goes against Pharaoh and he does all of these things, Pharaoh is not convinced. So Pharaoh says, I have that too. And this is Pharaoh's problem, is that every time Moses brings him something, he says, I have that too, or I have more than that, or I'm the one in charge. So Pharaoh says to his magicians, come and challenge this guy. But the magicians, this is a form of trickery. It's not real. In the case of Moses, this is a real transformation of the staff into the serpent, and all of these things are real. Whereas the magicians, it's a sort of magic, it's kind of fake, but people, it's like an illusion. So when the magicians go up against Moses, what happens to the magicians? They make sujood because they're like, whoa, we don't have that. That's real. We're just fooling around. This is real. So what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh tells his magicians, he is your leader. He's the one that taught you. Because Pharaoh, like Shaitan, is the spinster. He just spins everything. So now he's like, he's the one that taught you. And I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to jail you, and I'm going to kill you, and quarter you, and all of these things. But the magicians, they know that this is true. And this is one of the things that Allah always distinguishes in the Quran, truth from falsehood. And He says, جَاءَ الْحَقِّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. Truth comes and falsehood goes, because the nature of falsehood is it goes. It's built on a house of cards. So if something is false, eventually it will collapse. But when something is honest and true, it remains. And this is why Moses ﷺ ultimately persevered, and he took the Israelites with him, and he fled out of Egypt to safety. And this event we celebrate, this is Ashura. The event of Passover for the Jews is Ashura for the Muslims, and we celebrate on the 10th of Muharram. The 10th of Muharram, which is the first month of the Islamic year. And this is a time that we honor this event, this whole sequence of events that we've been reading, when Allah Ta'ala caused Moses and the Israelites to flee away from Pharaoh and cross the sea to safety. The funny thing about Pharaoh is that he ended up believing at the end. Pharaoh believed at the end, but it was too late. Allah Ta'ala says, Al-an, now after all of this, right at the moment of his death, he submitted. Why? Because truth is apparent. You can't hide that. But it was too late for him. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it not too late for us, that we use these opportunities to turn back. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم.